Thanks for listening to A Long Time in Finance with Jonathan Ford and Neil Collins, in partnership with Briefcase.News, the service that brings intelligent curation and analysis to your media monitoring. Our guest today, and you'll like this, Neil, argues that the world has gone mad.
Well, I mean, it's hard to challenge that, really, isn't it? You just look around you.
I know. He's also the author of a brilliant new book called The Unaccountability Machine: Why Big Systems Make Terrible Decisions and How the World Lost Its Mind. It asks why mistakes and crises that afflict the corporate world and the public sector never seem to be anyone's fault. We're joined today by an old friend of the show, Dan Davies, the author. He worked as an economist at the Bank of England and as a bank analyst before moving to consulting and writing. He's also the author of Lying for Money, a book about financial crime. So welcome back to the show, Dan.
Thanks very much. Long-time listener, second time guest caller, I guess.
Yeah. Well, maybe you can start by telling us about the book and its thesis. And is the world actually going mad?
You know, when you reach kind of a certain age, there's always a temptation to say that things are going mad and that they've always been better in the past. But I think that this time round, there is some decent reason to say that things are breaking down in a way that they don't usually break down. Mm-hmm. So I kind of started thinking about this, in the wake of the previous book, Lying for Money, because there's one phrase from that book which I borrowed from Bill Black, the American banking fraud investigator who cracked the savings and loans crisis. And it was of a criminogenic organisation. Royal Bank of Scotland is, a classic example. HBOS, perhaps even more so in the UK, where you just have an organisation not that was necessarily set up to be a criminal organisation, but was an organisation in which crimes would be committed if no one did anything specifically to stop them one by one.
Right.
That kind of interested me, that you could just have situations like we saw throughout the financial crisis, particularly through the LIBOR scandal, where people were left saying that they were absolutely horrified and appalled at the behaviour that had taken place in their banks, and there was no real reason to disbelieve them on this. And yet those very same people had created the conditions in which it was absolutely inevitable that something like that was going to happen. And so I got some good advice from some friends who are slightly older than me and who had been in management science for a lot longer, that what you needed to do was to go back to the 1970s.
Excellent decade.
And to the very early days of management science. It was a fantastic time for music and management science. That at one point, people were trying to take seriously the ways in which organizations could do things completely different from the purposes and intentions of all of the people who were meant to be managing them.
Now, you use this phrase in the book, unaccountability sink. Maybe you can explain a little bit what you mean by that, because it's a very interesting term.
Yeah, the idea of an accountability sink is that it's just this pool that you pour unwanted negative feedback and unwanted negative information into so that it stays harmless and it can't affect you. What they do is they erect a self-defense mechanism for themselves, which is to say they create a system that will take the decisions for them. And so everything can be blamed on the system. And then you take the final step of just breaking the feedback link to make sure that the system's decisions can't be second guessed. And now you've got a situation in which you have all the pleasures of being a manager, but you're no longer subject to complaints from the managed, the decided upon.
Your call is important to us. You're held in a queue.
Absolutely.
And you are number one in the queue. In other words, there's nobody there.
I actually did this once with, I won't name them, but a major UK high street bank. I was so curious about this that I called them at 3:00 in the morning on Christmas Day, and they were still experiencing a higher than normal volume of calls.
Very good.
But it's a horrible thing you're describing. Is it a new phenomenon? Is it possible to look back to we love a golden era on this show, a golden era where people were taking such decisions and welcoming feedback?
This is the trouble. The golden era was also horrible. Um, I think there is basically a big break in history here. And the big break is basically the Second World War. Because it's after the Second World War that you start getting really big, really complicated industrial corporations. It's after the Second World War that you have this big shift in the amount of things that the state is trying to do. And so you have this kind of Cambrian explosion in the complexity of organizations. So, if you read something like the autobiography of John Paul Getty, that's a book about a guy who takes loads of decisions and is really happy looking everyone in the face and saying, that's my decision, you guys have to live with it.
I welcome your feedback was possibly not in his vocabulary.
Yeah, absolutely. You go back forward to like someone like the chief executive of BP today. If you were to ask that guy, why did you do that? He'd look like you were crazy. I didn't personally make the decision to site that oil rig there. What are you talking about? Do you not understand how a company works? This is actually, if you go back to my mind, the first and one of the only management science books that's worth the paper it's printed on, Structure and Strategy by Alfred Chandler, which is also about the only management theory book that economists respect at all. He tells the story of DuPont, General Motors, General Electric, all of these big American corporations, by looking through their internal memos and really doing a kind of solid historian's job on it. And what he came up with the conclusion is that organizations tend to grow, obvious. As they grow, they get more complicated, simply because the number of connections scales as a multiplier of the number of things that they're trying to connect. At some point, the complexity will overwhelm them, and at that point, they will first try to deal with it by throwing more resources, managerial and technological, at their communication problem. After a while, they will realize that that can't be done, and they will reorganize. And it's that sort of thing that keeps on being repeated, keeps on being independently discovered by anyone who actually tries to look at management as if it was a science. You have this constantly increasing complexity and periodic crisis. And I think the argument of my book is that we're going through one of those periodic crises right now, just simply because the ability of our systems to handle the complexity of the world that they've created is in the process of getting overwhelmed.
We like to talk about finance a bit on this podcast. Clue is in the name. One of the functions of financial markets is supposed to hold managers and investors accountable for their decisions. But you argue really in the book that the market itself can be an accountability thing. Can you explain a bit what you mean?
Well, if you want to take a really unpopular decision, like closing down a factory, making people redundant, or if you're in the government, huge kind of welfare spending cuts, it's great to have the market to blame. Blaming things on the bond market or blaming things on the stock market is a big part of what that social institution is for. If you're in a developing country, you can blame the IMF. It's basically the same game. If you kind of think back, even as recently as a decade ago in the UK, the entire basis for the Osborne-Cameron austerity budgets was the idea that the UK was subject to global markets and that we couldn't borrow anymore because the markets wouldn't let us. Everyone likes that idea of having a kind of a higher power to appeal to, as if this was just something that happened to it, like a natural disaster hitting head office.
If one goes down to a micro level, though, perhaps you can talk a bit about a company that I think is very interesting, which is Boeing and all the issues that it had with, for example, the 737.
I think that what happened at Boeing was basically what I'd call a cybernetic problem. Cybernetics in context, it's a word that's become all sort of associated purely with science fiction and sex chat rooms.
I thought it was an exercise regime.
But originally invented in the 1940s, cybernetics was just simply applied mathematics in the context of information and control. The main problem of management is the transmission of information. And one of the big technological advances was financial reporting, just simply standardizing your reporting, boiling everything down to a profit and loss number. And then if you have a profit and loss number, the stock market will put a multiple on it and give you just literally a day-by-day barometer of how well you're doing. But the trouble is that all of these information technologies are also information filtering technologies. When you are looking at the financial results, you're looking at something where a lot of information has been thrown away. And in the case of Boeing, it was a lot of the engineering information that was being thrown away. Mm-hmm. So if you've got kind of safety concerns, or if you've got concerns about the ability of an outside vendor to cope with a rapidly changing specification, those things don't appear in the accounts. And so when you have a very financially oriented corporate culture, which Boeing never had, but McDonnell Douglas did have, and unfortunately in the merger of Boeing and McDonnell, it was very much the McDonnell people that ended up with the top jobs. What you always end up with is a boardroom debate where one guy is talking about slightly soft, airy concerns about engineering, and the other guy is pointing at the set of numbers which look like unarguable facts. And in that debate, people are always going to say, well, this guy can point to the facts. This guy's got on top of all of his numbers. Mm-hmm. And the person worrying about the long term is just special pleading. He's just trying to kind of keep overstaffed, and he's just trying to look after his engineering friends. Let's ignore that and let's concentrate on maximizing earnings per share. And then something happens and you get decades worth of avoided information and avoided feedback all landing on you in one horrible lump.
Another sort of unaccountability sink you write about is the tendency for businesses to borrow lots of money as a way in which they can point to the imperative of getting the cash flows to repay the debt. It's a criticism, I suppose, that is often levied at private equity. How big an unaccountability sink problem is that?
Well, it's a huge issue. In many ways, it goes back again to the 1970s, the decade when everything happened and I was born. This was the period of class war between the managerial class and the shareholder class. Going into the 1970s, you had the sort of the Mad Men era managements that were described in books like Barbarians at the Gate.
Yep.
It was kind of generally understood that the management of big corporations were the people who were in charge. They would provide themselves with expense account lunches, good salaries, country club memberships. They would throw the shareholders a dividend every now and then to keep them sweet. But basically, this was the way the world was going to be run by the professional managerial classes. And then starting, I would argue, in September 1970 with Milton Friedman's essay in the New York Times, The Social Responsibility of a Business is to Increase its Profits, we get what they called the shareholder value movement.
There's one thing, I've read Milton Friedman's essay, and it always seems to me it's been slightly misinterpreted. So in it, he says things like, well, if you want to have decent housing for your workers or decent education for their children or whatever, it's perfectly sensible for a business if they think that will, in the long run, improve their profits to use some of their cash to procure those things. So this idea that he was a scorched earth advocate always struck me as slightly unfair.
The trouble is, of course, that the ideologues and enthusiasts who really pushed these doctrines along. And of course, the other thing is that it comes back to some of the things that we were talking about with the 737 MAX, which is that you can make a case in principle that you paying an efficiency wage or giving your workers extra time off kind of works and helps productivity in the long run. But it's very difficult to see it in the system of accounts.
Well, yes. There's a great deal to dislike about private equity and the way that they've essentially made huge amounts of money by leveraging. I think that if you moved on to try and say, what should we do about it? And I think one of your suggestions is that that sort of structure should be made illegal. I think you're going to find yourself in a completely different sort of glue pot.
It's tricky. As well as having that controlling and financial anti-gravity effect, the leverage starts causing problems itself because it makes it impossible to do the sort of things in terms of investing in things that are good but in the long term, because an indebted company has to have debt service as one of its priorities, and a very indebted company can have no priorities other than servicing the debt, because if you don't make the debt payments, then you don't get a chance to do anything else. In terms of doing anything about that, the two proposals were that Paul Volcker, towards the very end of his last term as Fed governor, saw the LBO boom coming, thought that it was probably a bad idea, and proposed a straightforward gearing limit on investment companies, which would just block them from taking on that much debt. Obvious problems there. Sometimes companies do need to borrow a lot of money.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Warren, when she was running for president, had this idea that you could only have one layer of limited liability. So the underlying investors get limited liability in their purchase of shares or in their purchase of kind of units in a LBO fund. But otherwise, when one company takes over another, you legislate that it has to guarantee the debts of the company it's taken over, including the pension obligations. That seemed kind of interesting to me because it's a sort of information-based cybernetic solution to a cybernetic problem. What you're doing is you're saying you can take over this company with a load of debt, but that debt burden can come back to bite you in your returns as an LBO fund. It's not a one-way trade anymore.
Yeah, Charles Goodhart and an economist called Rosa Lastra came up with an idea which was designed to try and capture, because basically the problem is how do you identify who you want to send to prison, as it were.
Yeah.
And their idea was basically to break down equity holders in a sort of leveraged buyout into two categories, and basically say if you can control the firm, i.e. you're a controlling investor or you're the senior management of the firm who are always in league with the investors in a buyout, you don't have limited liability. But if you're an outside investor with no real control, you're okay.
At the end of the day, you don't necessarily want to go back to all of the management practices of the 50s and 60s. Lots of them were terrible. But yeah, at least that's kind of attacking the basic problem here of the accountability sink, which is that you've got people taking decisions, but also creating arrangements that make sure that they don't suffer negative consequences of those decisions.
Yes. I think that's absolutely key.
I feel there's a danger we're dropping into a different sort of sink, a gloom sink.
Yeah.
But you talk, I mean, obviously we talked about the idea of limited liability, but there are other characters in your book who you talk about. One of the heroes is a guy called Herb Simon. Does he offer any solutions?
Well, Herb Simon's theory of the firm is incredibly interesting because he says that firms aren't profit maximizers. Profit isn't the output that you're trying to maximize. It's one of the constraints on a company. And that what companies actually do in the real world of the 1960s when he was writing this is that you've got to make a bit of profit. You've got to make enough profit to service your debt. And then you've got to make enough after interest, after tax profit to pay your shareholders a dividend and keep them from breaking up the firm and doing something with the assets. But once you've made that constraint, the firm is free to do what it likes. Some of that is obviously going to be invested in waste and in managerial inefficiency, but some of it's going to be put into research and development. Some of it is going to be put into non-price competition. The other interesting thing about this school of thought on industrial organization is that people like Simon and Galbraith, whoever, were much less hostile to monopolies or cartels than modern kind of industrial economics is. Because the argument there was always that if you've got a literal monopolist, they're likely to be exploitative. If you've got a cartel, however, and you've got a sort of cozy arrangement not to cut prices, then companies will start to compete on non-price grounds. And non-price competition tends to mean pushing up quality, and that tends to involve much more investments in research and development. And so actually, these kind of cozy arrangements that have us paying a few cents more for our goods than we otherwise could in the absolute most competitive environment possibly, are often quite good for us in the long term.
It's a wonderful idea. I don't really see that that's ever going to fly, because the companies will have to explain to the customers why they're overcharging them. Lots of people will be saying, you can't justify this because actually you may be putting some of it into R&D, but you're probably spending most of it on bonuses for the executives.
And also, of course, it's not necessarily a theory that works all that well in a world where you have competition from China.
I just want to come back quickly to solutions. There is a modern movement which would take some of your thesis and say it's absolutely valid. I'm thinking of a bit of ESG, but more the kind of corporate purpose movement, the sort of stakeholder movement, which says that you need to think about more things than Friedman's supposed profit maximization. Do you think that there are any lessons that are valid from any of that, or is it just a lot of vaporware?
ESG, I always have a bit of a problem with, because it's three things that have nothing in common with each other, in a kind of context where it's kind of implied that you could trade them off one against each other. If you kind of have a really good recycling, then you might be allowed a bit of racism and term limits on your non-executive directors. The thing that interests me, actually, which has been happening, and I'm a great believer that these solutions end up coming out of the system itself.
Yeah.
Because the model of Alfred Chandler is of periodic crisis, but it's of periodic crisis dealt with by reorganization. So, to my mind, the model of the future might be someone like Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook or Meta or wherever, where you've got a guy who, from the very first IPO of his company, has made it very clear to his shareholders, this is my show, you people are just along for the ride. If it occurs to me that I want to divert half of my corporate cash flow into a weird virtual reality with no legs, then that's what's going to happen. And there are more and more companies like that. There's obviously Tesla, even Amazon, while it's very focused on delivering on financial metrics, is absolutely not focused on making things look pretty in a set of US GAAP accounts. And, there's actually potential these days for more and more companies to do that.
Well,
if Boeing had managed themselves that way, they might not be in the state they are today.
But all your examples are from first generation entrepreneurs, whereas most companies are not in that position. And I can't really see the incentive for a mature company, I don't know, like Unilever or Shell, to say, well, we're going to do what we want to do, and the rest of you can go hang, and if you don't like it, you can sell the shares. Because the people who are running these mature businesses are not in a position to dictate that sort of terms to their shareholders.
Fair point. I think Unilever did try to do that a few years ago, and it didn't take for exactly the reasons.
They threw him out.
I know.
I think it's not so much kind of declaring yourself to have a social purpose. At the end of the day, Unilever's purpose is to make soap. And that's okay. Not everyone has to change the world. Some people can just make soap. We all need it. But what I think the corporations do need to do, and may end up doing more and more, is taking advantage of the technology available to them to create information systems that are related to running their businesses and related to the things that they have to do in order to make better soap and sell it, rather than assuming that everything can be put into a framework, firstly, of annual and quarterly reporting. The big assumption of any set of financial accounts is that 3 months to a year is a meaningful reporting period for this organization, and maybe not to get so fixated on these very information filtered documents, which were appropriate to the kind of companies that we had 30 or 40 years ago. And we're even seeing the shareholders beginning to do that. The top tier of hedge funds these days use a huge amount of what they call alternative data, alt data. They will start looking at measures outside the accounts because it's the only way to get an edge over everyone else who's just using, the same data that's basically publicly available to everyone.
So do you think that IT will be the thing that stops the world going mad?
I can't see anything else that's going to do it. The thing that interests me is that there's a great quote from Stafford Beer, who is the wonderfully named father of management cybernetics, who was around in the mid-1970s when mainframe computers started being installed in all of the companies. He said that most corporations had just installed a mainframe in order to speed up their existing accounting and reporting systems. And he said that that was like if you had managed to hire Michelangelo, Einstein, and Leonardo da Vinci, and you put them to work memorizing the phone book so that you could look up numbers quicker. That was his view of how information technology had been used then. We're getting another chance with all of the developments in artificial intelligence and transforming neural networks. It's quite likely that the first reaction of companies is going to be to do exactly the same thing, which is to just try and use them to send more emails more quickly. It's a huge waste of the possibility of doing that. But people find solutions. Companies do reorganize, and companies do start to realize, particularly when you have cautionary tales like Boeing, which show that if you just concentrate on your small number of financial metrics, something bad will end up happening to you eventually.
Interesting. I've had to say, when we started off in the opening shots of this podcast, talking about the kind of computer says no systems that predominate in modern business, that AI would be a source of worry rather than a kind of source of hope.
It's potentially a source of hope. Used badly, you can dig a lot of very deep rabbit holes with artificial intelligence.
Well, we'll probably dig a few ourselves, actually.
Rabbit holes are our speciality.
That was A Long Time in Finance with Jonathan Ford and Neil Collins. Production and editing by Nick Hilton, and our sponsorship partner is Briefcase.News. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review it on your podcast app, as that will help new listeners find us.